Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula. I'm Adam from F1 Fantasy HQ, and I'm joined as always by Rob from F1 Fantasy Hub. Rob, we're filming on Halloween night, and we sure had some scares coming out of the Mexican Grand Prix. How did you think of the race?
Yeah, look, I thought the race was a pretty entertaining spectacle. A number of different strategies, obviously, with the new tire compound that Pirelli introduced, that altitude that we talked about last week played probably a factor in a couple of cars' performance. And we saw some surprises in qualifying from Lando, Daniel Ricciardo, and a few surprises in the race as well. Not too many kind of gremlins in any car's reliability or anything like that in the theme of Halloween, but a pretty good race to watch. I wouldn't say it was by any means the best race of the season, but there are a few moments of brilliance from a number of drivers that made me like, wow, it's been a good race. What was your take?
I didn't think it was a bad race, and one of the biggest things for me that made the race more enjoyable was Pirelli bringing the one-step softer tire. We had really undermined how many overtakes we were going to see in the race leading up to things, not knowing that it was going to unlock so many different tire strategies. And then you had drivers like Lando and Yuki. They were slapping on the hard tires early, catching up to drivers on the mediums that were reaching the end of their tire window, and that was opening up a ton of great overtakes. So it made for a lot more action than I was giving it credit for in the lead up to the race.
Yeah, definitely. I know we also, talked about how difficult it is to overtake at Mexico, and we saw some really impressive drives from Lando to come through the field. Yuki, until he spun out, also had a couple of really good overtakes as well. And then, some other cars such as the Aston Martins, which just weren't up to scratch. Ferrari were in the mix, as they always have been, but I was hoping for a little bit more from them over the course of the race. But notwithstanding that, a surprisingly good race, considering I was a little pessimistic on the kind of entertainment spectacle that Mexico might have put forward.
I might be a little biased, but my favorite overtake was Lewis on Charles. Lewis almost going up on the grass. That was one of my favorite overtakes, maybe of the whole year so far. So we have an action-packed show for you as always tonight. Let's talk about what we're going to review here. We'll review what happened in Mexico because there were some key takeaways that are going to really set us up for the last three races of the year. And then we'll move on to the last sprint race of 2023 at Interlagos and what are some of the key strategies we need to thrive this week. The FanAmp picks of the week are a staple on this show where we're going to talk about some extra special questions for this week. And then we'll share our initial lineup choices, and they may change as the week goes on, but we'll share with you what we have so far. And then last but not least, we'll talk about our fifth gear GARMS giveaway in question of the week. And so speaking of that giveaway and our contest, our winner this week chose to change my team name. And congratulations to Pranay for winning this week's contest. Pranay won a $50 gift card to our sponsor, fifthgeargarms.com, and changed my team name to Ferrari Fever. And maybe it'll inspire me to add some new Ferrari assets to my team in the lead up to Brazil. So as we look ahead to Mexico, so the top story for our teams was we trusted Perez. We told ourselves over and over again, we need to take a break from him. We saw this window after a good U.S. Grand Prix. We brought him back in, and he didn't make it out of turn one.
Yeah, look, I think the question that came out of the weekend is that, are we ever going to learn to just completely disconnect ourselves from Sergio Perez as a fantasy asset? Obviously, really disappointing again to DNF, but to do it at your home Grand Prix where there's just so much expectation, a lot of pressure, and to not even last a single lap, turn one, just absolutely heartbreaking for him. So, we've obviously been a little skeptical, had our reservations about him, particularly after his drives in Japan and Singapore, was it Japan and Qatar? I think it was, where he DNF'd in both of those. Obviously, that comeback in Coda, I think maybe we were a little bit misguided by one performance, and that clearly was the tail of the tape. So, unfortunately for us, most of which I believe who follow along were, well, not most, but quite a few of us watching or playing fantasy were in on Sergio Perez. It's obviously a shame to see him go out like that and ultimately go out of our teams.
And for anybody considering Checo in the next three races, this warning. So he has 3 negative point races out of the last 4. And when you look at the last 4 races, the only drivers to score fewer points than Perez are Logan Sargent, Liam Lawson, and Daniel Ricciardo. And remember, those last 2 haven't competed in all 4 of the last 4 races. So it is a good time to stay away from Checo unless you really want to roll the dice. And they mentioned this during qualifying last week. He hasn't qualified on the front 2 rows of the grid since Belgium. And since Belgium, both Ricciardo and Alex Albon have a top 4 start. So it's a really bad look for him, not just for fantasy, but for these other drivers in the Red Bull stable that are eyeing his seat.
Yeah, I mean, Ricardo, conversely, and we'll get into him a little bit later in the show, put in his best performance of this season, maybe even his best performance in a car since perhaps winning that race in Monza a couple of years back. So I was really impressed by him. Obviously, I mean, sorry, I might stand corrected. He had a great drive at Mexico last year as well and got driver of the day. But, the fact that he's being able to stick a car that, up until recently was objectively the worst car on the grid into P4 in qualifying. I think there was going to be an expectation he'd lose a couple of positions over the race, but to still come away with a few points in P7, a tremendous drive, and there's a lot more pressure on Checo now heading into next year.
Absolutely. So while we lament another tough race for Perez, looking at the other side, drivers that had a really great drive, we've got to talk about Lando Norris next. He started the race low. He had this issue in qualifying. He had one mistake on his first flying lap, and then his second flying lap was impeded by the yellow flag from the Alonso spin. So he started P17. They had him on an alternative tire strategy. We can see on the graph on the left, he came in early, climbed all the way up, hang out between P8 and P10. There was that really well-timed red flag from the K-Mag accident. And then he dropped a few places on the restart, but then had an enormous recovery all the way up to P5. So a terrific race for Lando.
Yeah, you wonder if it wasn't for that qualifying incident where he really couldn't get out of Q1, whether he'd be on for a podium. I had every expectation he probably would have been contending with Lewis for second place had everything gone his way that weekend, but still a tremendous drive to come through the field like that. I don't think we've seen that many overtakes in one weekend across the board since Netherlands, I think, this season, which had obviously the weather being a factor too. So a great result to come away with driver of the day, his best fantasy result of the season, and topped all drivers. So if anyone went with autopilot, they were handsomely rewarded with Lando's output. And I definitely think, that puts him in good stead for the remainder of the season as a fantasy asset. I don't have any intention of parting ways with him anytime soon either.
When you think about the steadiest drivers on the grid after Verstappen, Lando has 40 or more points in 3 straight, 30 or more points in 5 straight. So he's as solid as they come these days. And I'll tell you, I was very pessimistic on Saturday, seeing the low qualifying result, worried about Mexico as a low overtake track. And he really exceeded my expectations and helped salvage my weekend after the Perez incident.
Yeah, look, a great drive across the board is becoming, I think, after Verstappen, as you pointed out, one of the most reliable assets. I think Lewis certainly deserves to be in that conversation as well, and another asset that I think a lot of us are looking at for Brazil for a number of different reasons. But, as you pointed out, 3 40-point performances, hasn't had a score below 15 since, or only one score below 15 since Canada. So that level of consistency, I don't believe he's had a DNF this season either. Phenomenal reliability, not just as a fantasy asset, but as a driver too.
Rob, you mentioned a moment ago that the 16 overtakes were unexpected, and there were 3 drivers that had 10 or more overtakes. The number 2 driver for overtakes in Mexico was Yuki Tsunoda, who retained his budget driver crown in another surprise effort out of AlphaTauri. Obviously, the star of that race from the team was Daniel Ricciardo, sticking his second P7 in a row in Mexico. But Yuki, again, scoring 20 points from those 14 overtakes. Really a big surprise from him. 2 races in a row where he's looked this good.
Yeah, definitely. It's obviously a great sign at that price point. He's gone up a couple million in the last couple of races because of 50 points over the last 2 races. I think he's the 4th over between Coda and Mexico. I think he's the 4th highest scoring driver So a great sign, great value for money at the moment. And he's now equal second highest for overtakes in sprint and Grand Prix this season. So I think starting from the back, or at least close to the back, because a couple of guys started from the pit lane, were it was a surprise. I certainly thought he'd make a few passes, but the fact he was mixing it up in the points until that obviously costly error, trying to get past Piastri, not ideal, but imagine what it could have been had he not made that mistake. Could have been on for maybe another 30-point performance had he stayed in the points. But 20 points, if you had Tsunoda, I unfortunately didn't, but you did. You should definitely take that to the bank.
I was disappointed with the incident with Piastri because you could see he was a wounded car after that. Lando passed him very shortly after. And if Yuki had just exercised a little bit of patience, I think he would have gotten that position and had the top 10 finish. And then they called it out on the broadcast. He found himself in the grass and was punching the steering wheel and having this tantrum. Little did he know, he came back on track still as one of the fastest cars. He had 2 or 3 overtakes, and then there were a few surprise DNFs at the very end of that race. He found himself all the way back up at P12. I wonder if, with a little bit more focus and effort, if he could have gotten back to the top 10 just by merit had he focused.
I'd say it would have certainly been possible. It could have been a double points finish for AlphaTauri in Mexico had he been able to just stay the course throughout the race. But, that his teammate, Daniel Ricciardo, obviously well documented how well he did across the weekend. 12 points for him. His best fantasy result since coming back into, I guess, the frame post broken wrist. So great result for him. I had him not quite the 20 points, but the fact that he's able to deliver that kind of performance in a car which, since the upgrades, has actually looked quite competitive. And I'm of the view that these two guys, I know Daniel's a little bit more affordable than Yuki, but they both make for excellent budget options if you're really strapped for cash at the moment.
2 fun facts for you. One on Yuki is that he has 50 points in the last 2 weeks combined. The only drivers with more are Norris and Verstappen. That's how incredible Yuki's last 2 weeks have been. And in the early sims for Brazil this weekend, AlphaTauri are listed as the number 5 constructor. So in the fringe of points again. So like Rob said, for those of you that are cash strapped and not using something like Limitless this weekend, I would recommend both Ricardo or Yuki in a repeat performance in Brazil.
It's very much a fall from grace for Joe, though, who, up until recently was the king of the overtakes. And look, he's still certainly up there when it comes to overtakes. I just think he's probably just fallen off the pace a little bit. That Alfa Romeo is just so pedestrian. I know they've had their moments the last couple of weeks. Was it the double points finish they had in the US, or was it Qatar? One of the two. But they just don't look that competitive anymore. And he's just not really in the conversation, not really budget or budget adjacent, because he's kind of in that 7 million price bracket. And we haven't seen more than 6 overtakes from Joe since the Netherlands, which was an overtake fest. So he's kind of really fallen off our fantasy radars at the moment, which is a shame.
I was thinking the same thing. I wonder if in the evolution of these cars this year, if Alfa Romeo just haven't had the budget to keep up with these other teams, and those Singapore upgrades from AlphaTauri are really starting to propel them. And now they're up to P8 in the constructors title. And maybe there is this shift of budget driver king to one or both of the AlphaTauris.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd love to talk about the regression of another car in the Aston Martin a little bit later in the video, but we've certainly seen in the last few races the change of fortune for, the guys that earlier in the season, such as McLaren and AlphaTauri, that really struggled. They've really come up the field, and you've seen, Alfa Romeo that was, somewhat competitive early on in the season, and then obviously Aston Martin as well, and both of those guys have very much fallen back. I mean, looking at the constructors table yesterday, with 3 races to go, there's the only real position on the table to play for are the backmarkers at the moment, fighting for that cherished 7th place. But if AlphaTauri can put in a couple more drives like we saw on the weekend, then they could really chase down Williams for that spot.
It'll be interesting to see how it shakes out. And certainly as a Mercedes fan, I'm hoping they can hold on to P2 over Ferrari as well. This weekend will be very telling for that. Let's move on now to review our lineups from Mexico and see how we did. You can see we were both strapped with Perez this week. We took -10. Thank goodness he had those 4 overtakes before he crashed himself out of the race, or it could have been much worse. And the only difference was that I had Yuki and Rob had Danny Rick. So our global ranks, I think they dipped a little bit, but basically we're hanging out in the same range that we have over the last 3 weeks or so.
Yeah, it's a real frustrating position to be in with Perez. I was really hoping I'd be able to rebound after that disappointing Limitless in Austin, but that one man on our screen just seems to be letting us down every week. So he's going to come out of my team for sure. But looking across the board for the rest of the team, pretty good result. It was, I think, the first race this season where Red Bull wasn't even in the top 3 constructors, if I'm not mistaken. But or close to. So they were behind McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes. So a telling sign given Perez's mixed fortunes. But I just can't see myself moving away from Red Bull. I think Max and Lando are certain locks for the budget constrained. Ricardo, a great option, and McLaren, a great value for money constructor to own as well. So unless you're using a chip such as Limitless or Wildcard, don't know if there's going to be much change heading into next week.
I agree that we should keep Red Bull on our team because this week was really a worst case scenario. And even though they finished P4 among the constructors, they're only 24 points off of Mercedes for first place. If you look at other races, the difference between P1 and P4 can be upwards of 50, 60 points. That's a really big beating if you're on the wrong end of it. Max, just by himself, is able to hold on to that team so well that their floor is incredibly high.
Yeah.
If you like a funny story, I invite my followers to post their lineups on Sunday night and we can compare how everyone did. One of my followers outscored me with Liam Lawson on their team because they had Sainz instead of Perez. So I don't know whether to laugh or cry over that, but it was definitely an interesting comparison for sure.
That's kind of classic fantasy. You can put so much thought into what your decision making process is, but yet somehow, a DNF, which I've got my own point of view on how heavily weighted it is to disadvantaging your team, can really make or break your race week. So maybe this is a discussion for another time, but I really hope F1 consider adjusting that, because I think -20 is quite harsh for that kind of penalty when so many of us engaged strategists are putting a lot of thought and effort and time into making these decisions, and then to be hit with -20 for something like that, it's obviously a little bit of a kick in the guts.
You should have been in my living room when Yuki and Piastri made that contact. My blood pressure went through the roof because the thought of having Yuki, Piastri, Perez, Red Bull, and McLaren all taking a DNF, my heart couldn't handle that anymore.
No.
Let's look ahead to this week and start talking about Brazil. I think the most asked question we've had in the lead up to this race is, what do we do with our remaining chips? And there are 3 that were asked about the most: Limitless, Autopilot, and Final Fix. If you haven't used Limitless yet, Rob and I have been pretty steadfast this year that the sprint races are the best time to maximize the value of that chip. There are a lot of really good Limitless builds that I think we can start unpacking more when we get to the Interlagos history in the next section. But I would absolutely use Limitless right now if you still have it.
Yeah, fully agree. There are a few people that have saved their extra DRS for Interlagos, but I think most of those people have already used their Limitless chips. So it is, given they're the 2 most powerful chips in the game, last sprint race of the season, absolutely get that locked in. I think for Limitless, and I know we only have 1 practice session worth of information, as we always do on sprint race weekends, but I think a good starting point, a good skeleton for a Limitless team could probably consist of something like Red Bull and Mercedes as constructors, Verstappen, Hamilton, and Norris, and then the last 2 positions I'd probably have an opinion on, but I think there's maybe a little bit of variance between drivers such as Russell, Leclerc, and Sainz. Perez, if you can trust the guy, but I think given his form lately, you're boiling down to 2 Ferrari and George Russell.
When we look at the other chips, Autopilot, also a great week to have that chip. Max is typically the best 2X driver, but we're going to get into Lewis's history in a moment, and it's very strong and a really great buffer if you can have a build with those 2 Titans on your team. there's a decent chance that Lewis could pick up fastest lap or driver of the day or both and just edge out Max. And we saw last week that he can be beat, as Lando did a very similar thing between his overtakes and driver of the day. He edged him out.
Yeah, I mean, I've got autopilot left, and I'm definitely going to use it at either Brazil or Las Vegas. I think Las Vegas is more of, if I did use it there, a security blanket, because we haven't raced there before. It's got, very much, it is a straight circuit as well, so much narrower. But again, to your point you've made, Lewis has got an exceptional record at Brazil. If he's able to squeeze out, that one of those extra 10-point bonuses, then there's every possibility he can outscore Max. But Max has been exceptional in sprint races this year. I looked into the numbers a little bit earlier today. In the sprint races we've had, he's, outside of Baku, been the highest scoring driver in all of those races. And I think, given there's just more points on offer, he's got more of an opportunity to, if he has a bad, say, qualifying or a bad sprint qualifying, he's got that opportunity in such a good car to make those passes in the sprint race or in the Grand Prix and edge himself ahead of Lewis. But I think Mercedes have closed the gap to Red Bull, as we've expected. So I think there's probably more of an opportunity for Lewis to capitalize on the strength of that car, his record at Interlagos, and you never know, he could, as you say, come out with the highest fantasy score for the weekend.
And just to touch on Final Fix, it's a difficult chip to prepare for, but do keep an eye on Ferrari. They've had this rumor of taking a new engine for a while. Obviously, with only 3 races left, Abu Dhabi's probably too late, so it's either now or Vegas. So keep an eye out between the sessions. If they don't like what they see in qualifying, or if they qualify low, they may just suck it up and take the power unit. And then they're a great candidate for overtakes. And then maybe you want to make that final fix for if you have Lando, or God forbid you still have Checo in your lineup, a good swap you could make there.
Yeah, you've got your final fix as well, don't you?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. So I'm very, very tempted to use it this week if I see something that seems out of place in qualifying, because I think the overtake potential is huge for them.
Well, we had Magnussen on P1 2 years ago, so maybe we have someone like Ricardo or Yuki Tsunoda in like the top 2.
Whoa, that would be something special.
It would, wouldn't it?
That's a great segue into our history of Interlagos, because there are a few drivers that perform particularly well here. It's headlined by Hamilton. I think we know a lot of the headlines with Lewis. He's won this race 3 times. But what's interesting to me is that he's won driver of the day the last 2 years. So he won this race in 2021. And in 2022, George Russell won his first F1 race, but Lewis still got driver of the day because there was this contact with Max early in the race, sent them both down the grid, and Lewis made a really strong recovery run, whereas George didn't have to fight for first past the first few turns. And so Lewis got driver of the day then too. I think it shows how much momentum he has at this track and how he could be the top scoring driver this week.
Yeah, definitely. He's the honorary citizen, as you've been sure to remind me a couple of times at Brazil. And he's obviously got a great support network behind him in that part of South America. So I think you couple that with the overtakes in a car that looks exceptionally competitive. I have very high hopes for him this weekend. I think a lot of people, now that we all have a little bit more budget in our teams, Lewis's price hasn't quite increased as much as some of the other drivers we've had, such as Lando. I think that enables Lewis, but you can also go for, say, the Mercedes constructor if you want a piece of that Mercedes pie without having to outlay that cost of 25 odd million for just one asset in your team. So keep that in mind. But I think it makes Mercedes in general a very attractive assets to own heading into this race. So yeah, I think he'll feature in my team, or Mercedes will feature in my team. But by how much or how many assets, I'm not quite sure yet.
Something to think about too is Ferrari. Maybe it's just the new team name that's getting to my brain, but the early sims have them as the P2 constructor ahead of Mercedes, which I found shocking. And Sainz at this track, he finished P3 in 2019 and 2022. So he has a strong history at this track. And I think history could play into predicting some of these strong performances. It was in this space last week that we had predicted Daniel Ricciardo was going to have a good race because he had a P7 finish in 2022 and then top 10 finishes in the years before that. And it played out that way. So I wonder if this is another one of those tracks where history can predict a surprise finish.
Perhaps. I mean, I think we've been right on a number of occasions so far this season. I think we've also been wrong a couple of times too. So, but I think, as we pointed out, Mercedes has a great record there across the board. I don't know necessarily if I'm going to try and read into the simulations too much. And I'm not so sure if I can afford much Ferrari coverage this weekend, unless, of course, I want to compromise on say Lewis Hamilton. But with talk of that grid penalty you pointed out earlier that Leclerc may take, this would probably make the most sense for Ferrari to take a grid penalty, because at Las Vegas they've never raced there before, and then why would you take one at Abu Dhabi? So you never know. Leclerc could really enter the conversation as a very noteworthy fantasy asset to own, with that overtake potential if he starts at the back.
I've got a somewhat hot take on someone I may avoid this week that I otherwise wouldn't, and that's Lando. So when you look at his history at this track, he DNF'd in 2022. There was this incident with Charles early in the race that they both survived. Leclerc had a good recovery run. Lando kept going in the race. He had an engine failure later on. That's why he retired. But then he's never finished higher than P8 in his previous races. And it's interesting. You had mentioned this at the top of the show. He's one of only 3 drivers that haven't DNF'd this year. We have him, Verstappen, and Lewis, because technically he had a DQ, not a DNF. It's unlikely that 3 drivers go the whole season without an engine problem or an incident. So I'm thinking just law of averages, if it's going to come back to someone, and Lando traditionally hasn't done that well at this track, and is there room for Max, 2 Ferraris and 2 Mercedes and Lando in the top 6? He could be the odd man out of the top point finishes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point to make. I'm trying to not get too caught up in DNF history at circuits, because it's been something I've tried to, or at least I've read into a little bit in other races this season. And I mean, I know street circuits in particular can carry some degree of risk because of how narrow the straights and the turns are. But this is a track that is quite wide. There's a lot of opportunity to run wide and make overtakes, passes, etc. The McLaren, I'd also argue, is probably the strongest McLaren Lando Norris has ever been in since he's driven on the grid. So sure, I mean, I certainly get that he hasn't ever, I don't think you said he'd ever podiumed at Interlagos, and that's fair enough. But I also fully expect, with the form he's in at the moment in such a competitive car, particularly at circuits like Mexico, for instance, even the US Grand Prix, where we were very, very low on McLaren, he still seemed to turf out 2 podiums. So I'm not going to write him off entirely, but law of averages, I will give you that. There's probably got to be at least one chance he DNFs this season, but it would have to be if he has another poor qualifying, gets caught up in the meat grinder of the back markers. That probably where that could have a little bit more risk.
We'll see how that one shakes out, and we'll see if I have the guts to actually pull Lando from my lineup, because I suppose I have to put my money where my mouth is if I think it's really a hot take.
Sure.
Let's move on now to the FanAmp picks of the week. And so we have 3 because it's a sprint weekend. So in qualifying, which previous Brazilian Grand Prix race winner qualifies the lowest? We have George, Lewis, and Max.
That's a tough one, because Mercedes, we've talked about how good they can be at Brazil. Max, a sensational qualifier for the most part. I'm going to say George Russell. I just think he has looked much weaker this year than he did last year. Lewis is in a rich vein of form at a circuit he loves, and Max Verstappen, the only person I can really see. I know there's been P1s from Mercedes at various points in the last couple of seasons, but for me, Leclerc's the only real threat to Max as a qualifier. So I have to say George Russell out of these 3 guys.
Unfortunately, I agree. As much as I'd like to see George qualify in the front row, he hasn't had the best qualifying form this year. He might surprise us in the race. He surprised us in the race last year too. So Hopefully he qualifies in the first row or two, but of these three, unfortunately, he's the last.
Next question is, how many overtakes in the sprint do we expect there will be? 20 or more, 10 to 19, or 9 or less? What's your take, Adam?
I did my homework. There were 38 overtakes in the sprint at Brazil last year, so give me the over.
I was going to say 20 or more seems very likely. It's a circuit that has so much opportunity for people to run 2 cars wide in a lot of parts of the sectors, and particularly that kind of anti-clockwise straight coming through sector 3 into sector 1. A lot of parts of the track there that you're going to see, teams with high top speeds or high straight line speed like Ferrari and Williams, Red Bull make those passes. So keep an eye on Charles Leclerc, Alex Albon, Carlos Sainz to snap up a few of those if for whatever reason we find them kind of qualifying below P3, P4.
Sounds good. And for the Grand Prix, which tire strategy does George Russell use?
I think a lot of that hinges on largely if it becomes a red flag or a safety car in the race. I'm not going to say I know off the top of my head what the historical tire strategy for the Brazilian Grand Prix is, but I'm going to say 2-stop. I don't say that with a lot of confidence, though.
I'll run through these really quickly in my head. No stops in a full-length race means a disqualification. Maybe you have an incident like Spa a few years ago where the race is terminated due to weather or something. That's the only other way you could do no stops. Pirelli are saying this is either a 1-stop or 2-stop race with, I think, strategies leaning toward 2-stop. 3-stop would be if you have a safety car or red flag and you want a cheaper free pit stop, or you're fitting softs at the end of the race because you have a 20-second gap to the next position you want to steal fastest lap. I'll probably say George keeps it right over the middle and does a 2-stop strategy.
Yeah, fair assessment. You provided a lot more context to that question than I certainly did.
I've only won the FanAmp Picks of the Week once all season, so context aside, it seems like someone always beats me. Let's move on now to the weather, because for the first time in a while, there is a little rain. And Friday's important this week because we have free practice 1 and qualifying. So the one session we have to actually make some inferences on the cars could be under wet conditions. And then the qualifying that sets the grid for Sunday could be under wet conditions where we see some maybe surprise Q1 exits. If you have a track just getting wet or a track just getting dry, tire strategy timing could be huge.
Yeah, I mean, heading into Brazil from months ago, I was always conscious of weather risk, rain risk. Definitely not as bad as it's been in the past, but the Friday qualifying could really spring a couple of surprises on us. So just keep that in mind. That was exactly how Kevin Magnussen managed to qualify on P1 2 years ago with that. Was it George Russell who crashed that got K-Mag, the P1, whatever it was prompted by the wet weather. So, as we said earlier, it could spring another surprise on us where someone from the midfield somehow jumps up into P1, P2. But if it's a dry race, Saturday, Sunday, Interlagos is one of my favorite circuits on the calendar. I always find it such a great racing spectacle for those overtakes. So hopefully it's an uninterrupted sprint and Grand Prix.
We'll see how that shakes out. And for those of us with the final fix, we're keeping a close eye on that rain on Friday and what it does to the action on track. Let's talk about our lineups now, because I had some real difficulty setting mine. And as soon as I submitted this to our producer, I already had some buyer's remorse about a lineup that includes Alonso. I was trying to obviously fit Verstappen and Hamilton with 2 safe constructors, put my money where my mouth was on Lando to fit my budget. But I'm not really happy with where I landed, because Aston Martin has given us absolutely nothing these last few races. They double DNF'd in Mexico. Zhou has been good with overtakes, but like you said, over the last 5-6 races, that's faded a bit, and the AlphaTauris have taken its place. So I'm a little bit jealous of your team, and seeing it across the screen here, I might steal it.
Look, I would have loved to have got to Alex Albon. I think if you have the budget to swap out Sonoda for Alex Albon, that is a great option, just because of the straights through sectors 1 and 3. I'm priced out, I think, by 0.2 million or something absurd like that. So not too pleased about that. But I think, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, Red Bull and McLaren, and probably Ricciardo as well for me, just because of his price point, all almost certain locks. Lando looked great. I know there could be a reason to move him out for someone like Charles Leclerc if we find those grid penalties come up. And then, Sonoda, I guess he's been the budget driver king lately, so seemed like a logical fit if I couldn't stretch to Alex Albon. Fernando Alonso, I know you have some kind of uncertainty around him as a fantasy asset, and understandably so. What was the logic that you decided to land on him initially? I know we haven't locked in our teams, but walk me through that.
I thought race history was helpful. I still have a sense that those upgrades from Aston Martin should be okay. I think back to Qatar, or maybe it was the US, whatever race it was, where Stroll really looked good with that new floor and the new concept they had. It's just a matter of keeping the car on track and trying to get as much performance from the car as you could in qualifying. But it does mean I'm extrapolating a lot, because these last few races, they've given us almost nothing, and they seem to be retiring the car for a lot of strange reasons too. Alonso had a weird spin that interrupted Q1 in qualifying for Mexico, so even he seems off. And maybe I'm thinking too much into this, but he's had a very busy week in the news too. So is any of this getting in his head? The rumors of retirement, the rumors of joining Red Bull? Like, I'm not sure if I want to take all these risks on Alonso.
Yeah, I think, he had that great drive back in the Netherlands, 62 points. A lot of that, again, was because of the overtakes most drivers racked up that weekend. But, since then, 5, -1, 16, 25, -9, -16. DNFs have obviously played a part in that too, but the car just looks abysmal. Like, you're seeing him getting passed by Logan Sargent, for goodness sake, and he just doesn't seem to have anything. Like, he's a great driver, but a part of it obviously comes down to the car too, and it just doesn't seem to have the pace. All of their upgrades have gone backwards. It's a pretty sorry sight for someone who, 6 months ago we thought would be challenging Max for the World Drivers' Championship.
It's definitely been a sad state of affairs for Aston Martin. And I think as the week goes on, you will probably see me pivot out of him somewhere. It's interesting, though, on these sprint weekends, we don't usually have the benefit of rider simulations. We only have one session on track, and it's going to be wet. So I might just have to make a couple of dart throws on Thursday night and Friday morning to set my lineup and just go with it. And I'm hoping for some sense of differential this week. I want to try to claw my way up without doing anything that's too dangerous.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of teams that are zombie teams that obviously haven't changed their lineup. People that are no longer playing the game, that have the triple Red Bull, the triple Aston Martin, and Joe in their team. And last week you had Stroll -16, Perez -10. Alonso -16, Perez -10. Stroll's looked pretty out of shape as well recently, and Joe came away with 2 points. So a lot of those guys that looked pretty good after the 10 or so races that hadn't changed their team once are probably sitting in the hundreds of thousands again.
And in my mind, I'm trying to see if I can go through 2 levels of zombie teams. There's the teams that were triple Red Bull, triple Aston Martin from the summer. And then I wonder if there are teams that are just maybe not hitting whatever their targets are. They're out of their mini leagues. They're in the 4,000 or 5,000s, and they know they're not going to win the whole thing. And maybe they're quitting with a triple Red Bull, triple Aston Martin. So now these are the races where these little differentials could get me past some of those other teams that have started to give up. So fingers crossed that this is the week you and I make a comeback, because we're due for some good luck.
Yeah, definitely. I think my my hopes of a 1,000 top 1,000 is certainly out the door, but top 5,000 is fading pretty fast as well. So just one race without a DNF would be nice. I don't think I've had one race since Monza that I haven't had at least one driver in my team not finish the race. So just one clean race week would be obviously much needed.
I'm pulling for you, Rob. I hope that lineup does it for you. Let's move on and finish with our contest for this week. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner which constructor will score the most fantasy points this week, Ferrari or Mercedes. So make sure you head over to the FanAmp app, go to the Fantasy Formula base, and tell us in the chat. I'll have already posted my answer in there so you know where to go. The winner will again receive $50 toward our sponsor, fifthgeargarms.com, and you'll have the chance to rename either my team or Rob's for Las Vegas. And remember, use our code FANTASY10 for 10% off your next order on fifthgeargarms.com. Rob, do you want to comment on which constructor you think will score more?
Yeah, I think heading into this weekend, I was pretty high on Mercedes. I still think they will have a very good race. But you obviously called out the simulations earlier. Ferrari do look quite competitive. I think they will be, a force to be reckoned with around Interlagos with those straights, as I mentioned before. But I just think with the home crowd support for Lewis and the team, I'm expecting Mercedes to put in a very decent points performance. So the Silver Arrows are my pick there. What about you?
I am going to put some positive energy in the world and go for Ferrari because, one, I'm hoping that Mercedes will hear me say that and put 2 on the podium. But also, I think, truthfully, Mercedes is going to finish higher in the race, but Ferrari will score more points because they're going to take those engine penalties, make all those overtakes, and still find themselves in the top 5 to 7. So that's how they do it.
I think as well, Ferrari have had a few extra instances this season of fast pit stops. So and Mercedes just aren't quite, they're obviously fine at the pit stops too, but Ferrari have had their moments in the pit for better or for worse, but those fast pit stop points have come into fruition a couple of times this season. So maybe they bank 3, 5, maybe even a 10-pointer if they can rival it with McLaren, for instance.
I'm really looking forward to this week. I thought I would be a little bit burnt out at the end of a triple header, but I'm as excited as ever for this race. Should be a good one.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to it too. And deadline stream on Friday. So lots to look forward to, right?
Deadline stream is on Friday, 1 hour before qualifying. We're going to have some of the top players in the world in the chat hanging out with us. Rob and I are going to field all of your questions, and we have a special guest that'll be joining us with some extra perspective as we look ahead to this week's race. So I'm really looking forward to our stream too.
Can't wait.
That's our show for tonight. Good luck this week, and I hope to see you all on Friday.